Positive gambling? Assessing the effects of casinos on American Indian reservations. American Indians experience some of the highest rates of poverty in the country. As of 2014, it was estimated that 26% of American Indians experience poverty, which is nearly triple the rate of white Americans. The poverty rate for families living on reservations is 36%, which is drastically higher than the national rate of 9%. The duality between American Indians and the rest of the country highlights that Native communities are under-resourced, and it is imperative that something be done to help these families economically. American Indian life expectancy is 5.5 years less than the average American, and the reason for this starts during childhood. Quality health care is much less accessible in regions with high American Indian populations, and most available care is for emergencies, while preventative care is hard to find. Furthermore, making up 1.1% of students in public schools, American Indians have the highest high school dropout rates in the country compared to any other race group. American Indians have been neglected by the federal government and experience some of the worst living conditions, poverty rates, and educational outcomes among Americans, which makes them essential to understanding poverty and inequality in the United States as a whole. American Indians were the first people to establish settlements on land we now know as the United States. Despite many decades of less than reasonable treatment, many Indian tribes have established their own nations that function partially as their own countries while still having ties to the United States. There are 345 tribal nations in the contiguous United States that are recognized by the federal government. It is estimated that over 3 million American Indians live on reservations. Since its inception, the federal government has treated American Indians very poorly. Before 1988, there were a few policies that were enacted to positively impact American Indian communities. In 1819, many American Indian children were forced to attend Indian boarding schools that aimed at assimilating them into Euro-American culture. The federal government hoped to forcibly suppress, eliminate their cultural beliefs, and eventually eradicate Native culture. Furthermore, during the 1830s, many tribes were forced out of their homeland and told they had to move to new Indian territory west of the Mississippi River. The government gave little compensation to these people, and they had little choice but to move. Given the failure of the federal government in ensuring the economic success of American Indian people, American Indians were forced to find their own remedy for poverty that would improve their economic circumstances. As a result of American Indians' poor economic conditions, many groups have sought an aid to their economic problems that can stimulate Indian economies. In 1976, the Oneida tribe of Wisconsin launched a bingo operation to help keep their nation afloat financially. Many other groups followed suit, and by 1984, there were 80 tribes that offered bingo on their reservations. Although there was strong private opposition, the federal government was most concerned about the lack of regulation for these operations, and they vigorously tried to get nations to agree to legalize gaming with federal oversight. Over ensuing years, there was lots of back and forth between the federal government and tribal nations about legalized gambling, and it came down to being an issue of these nations' rights and right to self-determination, which prevailed. They insisted they had the right and ability to regulate their own gaming. The argument for legalized gaming on Indian lands was that it would be used as a tool for economic development, which was desperately needed. The fight for legalized gaming on Indian lands eventually culminated in the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act in 1988, which allowed for tribal-owned gaming facilities on tribal land that would be regulated by the National Indian Gaming Association. The National Indian Gaming Association was formed to regulate gaming on Indian lands, as well as foster growth of gaming in nations that sought it. The National Indian Gaming Association's goal, and one of the main goals of gaming establishments on American Indian land, is to rebuild communities through self-reliance. The IGRA also allowed for Class 3 gaming, which consisted of common table games and slot machines. American Indian casinos that popped up because of the IGRA caused an overwhelmingly positive effect for the nations in which they operated. The IGRA required that all Indian casinos be owned by federally recognized Indian nations, and that all revenue from the casinos be used to improve tribal welfare. There are 5 options for how a given nation can choose to use its profits. They can use revenue to fund tribal government operations or programs, provide general welfare for the tribe and its members, promote tribal economic development, donate to charitable organizations, or support local government agencies. American Indian Nation's goal for opening casinos was to provide improved economic conditions for their residents and move tribal nations toward economic independence. From 1990, just after the IGR was passed, to 2010, various statistics regarding economic and social conditions improved disproportionately for American Indians compared to the rest of the United States. In that period, real per capita income rose 48.6% for American Indians compared to just 7.8% nationally. Family poverty decreased 15.4% compared to rising 0.9%, and unemployment decreased 6.9 percentage points compared to rising 1.6 percentage points. It is reasonable to assume that legalized gaming on American Indian reservations significantly contributed to this improvement in economic conditions for American Indians. Given an increase in income and a decrease in both poverty and unemployment, the goals of the American Indian nations are achieved by opening casinos. In general, opening casinos does improve economic conditions for American Indians living on reservations. Many people think that gaming on reservations produces overwhelmingly negative effects for American Indians because of perpetual problem gambling, but the research suggests that gaming on reservations provides positive economic outcomes for American Indians. Many people think that casinos on Indian land will only affect American Indians, but the research suggests that one of the groups most affected is non-Indians living within 50 miles of casinos. Casinos on reservation land produce positive impact for those that are American Indians living on reservations, but there are mixed effects for the general population that lives in the areas surrounding casinos. Almost 3/4 of workers in Indian casinos are not members of the Indian tribe where they are located. This helps employment rates in the areas surrounding casinos and gives some non-American Indian positive impacts from casinos. Furthermore, most tribal casinos are small operations that mostly cater to local clientele and are not considered destination casinos. Although there are some positive effects for the surrounding community, the National Opinion Research Center estimates that living within 50 miles of a casino doubles the chances that someone will become a pathological or problem gambler. These are people that have the uncontrollable urge to keep gambling, even though it has overwhelmingly negative effects on their life. Also, it is estimated that 1/3 of gamblers have filed for or are filing for bankruptcy. Between 1989, just after the IGR was passed, and 1998, the personal bankruptcy rate in the United States doubled. Over the same period, personal expenditure on gambling increased by 75%. In this time, gambling became much more accessible for many Americans as casinos opened across the United States on American Indian reservations. The non-Indians who live close to casinos are unintended collateral damage that have resulted from casinos opening. Given that the goal for opening casinos on American Indian land was to improve the economic circumstances for those living on reservations, the IGR was practically effective. And given that the act was passed by the federal government, it was most definitely politically feasible. But the question remains whether legal gaming on reservations is morally permissible. Historically, American Indians have been at the very bottom of many economic metrics compared to other racial groups in the United States, and the goal of implementing casinos was to improve those exact circumstances. But is it permissible to implement a program that puts substantial amount of people into poverty to improve the lives of American Indians who are already experiencing poverty? Americans can suffer a complete loss of their livelihoods, families, and assets as a result of problem gambling at these very casinos. At the same time, American Indian nations have suffered similar losses over their history, but in this case, it was no fault of their own. Through the lens of a philosopher like Robert Nozick, gaming on American Indian lands is just, because under his entitlement theory, it is just to allow the gambler who obtain the resources justly to do whatever they want with them, and if the casino is transparent about the rules of games, they are entitled to whatever they may gain from the gambler. Similarly, someone like John Rawls would argue that legal gaming is morally permissible. An unbiased contractor behind a veil of ignorance would see that people who gamble understand the risk, and the ones who stand to benefit from the player's losses are in a position where they would experience high marginal benefit from winning their games, which makes gambling on Indian reservations permissible. Alternatively, a utilitarian would have a more complicated view on the issue. They would see that gambling is morally permissible until the point that the marginal gain from the casino is less than the marginal loss that the gambler would face from losing money. It is reasonable to assume that they would only support gaming in casinos like those on Indian reservations that redistribute profits to people who are severely under-resourced, and not gambling in casinos that are designed to make the rich richer. Ultimately, what goes beyond all three of these arguments is that as a society we are obligated to treat all individuals with dignity and self-agency. It should not be up to any one person or governing body to decide whether being a gambler is morally permissible. It should be up to an individual to decide whether gambling is practically permissible for them. Even though we have a negative consequence from gambling, individual dignity prevails and permits people to make their own decisions about what they do with their money. Legalized gambling to redistribute wealth to people experiencing poverty has been effective in improving economic outcomes, but has actively destroyed the well-being of others. This topic is so important in understanding poverty and inequality in the United States because it makes one ask themselves if an anti-poverty program can be truly considered effective if it brings one group out of poverty while putting a different group into it. Permissible or not, gaming will continue on American Indian reservations for years to come, and only time will tell what gaming's true impact on society as a whole will be. Thank you.